we presume to know how land figures into current Eurocentric cultures. But how does it figure in a culture distinctly different from that which is operative in the modern Western world? Here I shall be invoking traditional Native American culture as espousing a distinctly different sense of land that is not simply a stretch of space or somewhere to settle. For many Europeans and Americans, and for all too many others around the globe today, land is something to be owned, if not by oneself, then by a landlord or a corporation. Ownership of land obtains for the purchase and sale of property in an established market economy that determines the current exchange value in so many dollars or euros for a given plot of land. Exchange value enables one to say that one owns it as one's own property, a word whose root, proprius, means own or proper. But as owned, land is not necessarily experienced as familiar, since one can own a piece of land one has never seen in first person. Land as owned can be absent from the owner's daily life, rendered foreign since others can buy it from us at a certain purchase price that reflects what it is worth in the local and current real estate market. But quite apart from ownership, land can also be seized by people coming from elsewhere who claim they have a right to be there, to occupy it. We see this massively in the history of the American West, where newcomers to a given territory claimed a certain tract of land as their own, as did my own Swiss ancestors in Kansas in the 1850s, or as occurs today in Israeli settlements in the West Bank, where Jews from America and elsewhere claim the right to occupy land inhabited by Palestinians for many centuries. In both cases, and in many other variants as well, we have to do with a dispossession, whereby newly arrived settlers claim the right to occupy and live on lands that were originally inhabited by native populations, but who are now pushed off these same lands, if not eased out, then forced out. Now, such land grabs, as we could call it, are all too well known in many places around the globe, from the Middle East to the Far West. What is less discussed and understood is just why such acts of dispossession are so devastating to native populations who have inhabited the very same land that is subject to such widespread seizure. Put otherwise, just why is what is now designated as settler colonialism so harmful to native peoples? The answer resides in the relationship of the human body to the earth. For it is precisely this relationship that has been passed over, where over signifies a passing by, a failure to attend to what the earth in the form of land both demands and makes possible for human beings. But here I'm getting ahead of my own story. In an attempt to address these closely related issues, I shall proceed in 5 stages by discussing in turn these topics: oblivion, dispossession, borderlands, the human cost of displacement, and earthwork. Oblivion. The oblivion starts with my own family. As I have mentioned, my ancestors were early settlers in the Midwest region of the United States, first settling in Ohio and then in central Kansas in the 1850s. At that point, that part of Kansas was open territory. Laying claim meant that the newly arrived party need only declare, "This is my land." It was understood that one was going to work the land a version of Locke's labor theory of value, whereby one has a right to declare as private property that on which one's physical labor has been or will soon be expended. Digging into the ground in order to plant the seeds for crops, eliminating trees, channeling waterways, and such. This is exactly what my maternal Swiss ancestors did. They set about growing grains, especially barley and wheat, in an effort to create a sawmill. They had been millers in Switzerland and wished to do something comparable in the presumptively free land of Kansas. By the 1880s, they had built a mill in Enterprise, Kansas, and diverted the Smoky Hill River to propel its wheat grinding wheels. In another chapter of this early family history, my maternal grandfather participated in the Oklahoma land rush of the late 1880s. In this case, land was there for the taking. All one had to do was to pitch a tent on open ground and declare it one's own. The land was there for free. No questions were asked, nor was there required an expenditure of physical labor. Now, when I grew up in Topeka, Kansas, in the heart of the Middle West, I heard both of these stories as part of my family history. Especially notable was the fact that they never included any mention of the Plains Indians who had been forced out of the same lands settled by early members of my family. Though there can be no question that they had inhabited these lands for many centuries before the arrival of European settlers. In the public schools I attended in Topeka, there was no mention of the Indian presence in what came to be called the Kansas-Nebraska Territory. In effect, Native Americans were erased from the history of that part of the world. It is only more recently that I came belatedly to learn of their presence, which in fact extended far back in time and included numerous tribes who inhabited that part of the world. Second topic, dispossession. Whether by quiet retreat or by armed struggle, Native Americans not only moved out of the way of the early settler colonialists, but in effect ceded the land to the settlers, land on which they had lived from time immemorial. They were dispossessed of the land over which they had roamed, chased buffalo, and set up tent cities that were only rarely meant to be permanent. The original dispossession was for the most part realized in silence, leaving the lands they had traversed freely, though sometimes in competition with other Indian tribes, open for settlement by white settlers. No questions were asked, no prices were demanded, as these lands were abandoned by Native Americans in acts of literal dispossession, letting them go, though sometimes with a fight. In contrast with birds that perch but do not possess positions in space, settlers seek to move into open land and stay put there if the living is viable and the climate is congenial enough. No sooner was I born in Topeka, Kansas, again in 1939, than my parents purchased a house that remained in the family until 1967. This house was a stable residence, where reside originally signifies to settle, to take up one's abode or station. They purchased not only a physical house as their home, but the land on which this house was located at the western edge of town. The house rose vertically out of the horizontal soil on which it was situated. For my parents, house and land alike entailed claims to ongoing ownership. each was subject to a form of legally sanctioned possession that served to prevent arbitrary dispossession, which could happen only by bankruptcy or occupation by a foreign power. By the time I was growing up in Topeka, the Indians of that region were nothing but ghosts. I was told of the so-called Indian school outside of Topeka, where young Indians were sent to learn the ways of the settlers, and an artificially created lake as well near Topeka was named Lake Shawnee, belatedly invoking the Shawnee Indians who had once occupied that part of Kansas. And the county in which Topeka was located was and still is called Shawnee County. Other than these nominal mentions, there was nothing but silence. The original presence of Native Americans in Kansas was not just forgotten, but never acknowledged, never spoken of in public schools or the halls of state government, never mentioned in local newspapers. It was as if the Shawnee Indians had never existed, or at most had existed in legends that were as vague as they were infrequently cited. Native Americans originally from that part of the United States and from many other parts of North America as well were in effect pushed underground, buried in a forgetfulness that clearly had a point, which was not to be troubled by the dispossession effected by one's ancestors and countless other early settlers in the Middle West. Now, dispossession is a highly ambiguous word in English. Literally, it can be taken to be a forceful taking of something from someone who formerly owned or possessed anything from a book to a rifle. Less literally, it can signify a more subtle deprivation, a rendering unavailable of something others have assumed was their own. The dispossession of Native American lands is an instance of the latter. Integral to the fate of the natives who once lived there was the deprivation of land they were accustomed to traversing as part of seasonal patterns of collective movement. Now, this dispossession was often de facto, a silent transfer of land, such as happened when settler colonialists simply moved into given tracts of land, and by this act of usurpation, took over these lands in the American West. This was an act of dispossession, even if it was wordless and did not depend on any treaty with the Native Americans of a given region. Treaties tended to come later and were largely statements concerning what was already an accomplished fact. When we reached this stage, there was a more exact determination of the land at stake, typified in the fixing of mappable borders around the land in question, as in various treaties between Native Americans and the US government, most of which existed more in their breach than in their honoring. Before the stage of imposed borders, there were what I like to call these days boundaries. That is, edges that are determined by and are typically congruent with features of the natural landscape. Thus, the Badlands of South Dakota provided natural boundaries for the Lakota Indians as they migrated seasonally in and around the conspicuous hills of that part of the Midwestern landscape. Whereas the Badlands themselves came to be regarded as situated within the official borders of South Dakota, as these were officially designated when South Dakota became a state in 1889, were officially signified the status of lands no longer occupied by the Lakota people and now largely inhabited by European settlers. Even if named in various treaties, Native Americans had little, if any, say in the creation and ongoing means of governance, a governance now fully in the hands of the settlers, whether as state legislators or as local land patrolmen. Put more forthrightly, it was a case of outright land theft, where the theft, the stealing, was of what will become known as property once it is legitimized in legally sanctioned land deeds. In other words, theft becomes possible only through what is legally considered as property. Borderlands. In his recent book, The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee, David Troyer writes that Columbus and Cabot and the rest didn't discover the New World or new peoples. They met Indians with distinct histories, homelands, and technologies, and deeply considered concepts of themselves and their place in the world. Homeland is a deeply resonant word, especially when it comes to Native American life. Taken literally, it combines two things: land, thus region and territory as well, and home, hence place of origin, an ongoing place to return to. My own first and still vividly remembered home was a white brick middle-class house in Topeka, but my homeland was in eastern Kansas, an area covering hundreds of square miles. The house in which I grew up acted as something like a cynosure, a felt center of my sense of locatedness in that part of Kansas. Despite this more encompassing placement, my home in Topeka had an address that was altogether numerical: 3210 West 17th. Having such a numerically specific address would have been unthinkable in the Lakota, for the Lakota and other native tribes, as was building a single house meant to last for generations. For Native Americans, their home is found in several places located throughout their homeland, a land that had no precise borders, even if it did have certain natural boundaries. Rather than a single place or built structure, their homeland was their effective home, an entire region through which they moved on a seasonal basis. It is telling that Gaston Bachelard, in his book, Poetics of Space, makes the paradigm for home a house, typically the house in which one grew up and spent at least a significant part of one's childhood. In later years, even when one has moved on and is no longer living in that house, it remains a powerful presence as it is recalled room by room and floor by floor. As Bachelard puts it in Poetics of Space, the house of one's childhood home is one of the greatest powers of integration for the thoughts, memories, and dreams of mankind. Without it, man would be a dispersed being. It is body and soul. It is the human being's first world. End of quote. With some exceptions, such as the Chumash in Southern California, home for many Native Americans had two outstanding features. First, it was not centered on anything like a house. It is dispersed, in Bachelard's telling term. The majority of Native Americans lived in tents that could be taken down handily and carried to the next encampment. This means that natives themselves are very unlikely to dwell in anything like a single lasting physical structure, as on Bachelard's paradigm of the house and my own experience in Kansas. For Native Americans are continually on the move in keeping with the collective migration of one's tribe of origin. In such continual movements, there is nothing like a house at a single location that could be called home. A tribal member's imagination and memory are immersed in the traversal of entire regions. When these regions are considered together, they form the homeland for members of a given tribe, a homeland that is their effective home. In the life world of a Native American, the main directionality of their homeland is horizontal, not vertical. There one moves laterally across the land with others, rendering unlikely any memories of being a discrete being in a single residence in a single place, as on Bachelard's paradigm of a constructed house. The most significant memories are set in the various places that punctuate nomadic movements across entire regions. Now, such movements with others across entire borderlands is nomadic in Deleuze and Guattari's sense of the term. Whereas the migrant, in contrast, moves from one point to a second definite point, that is the country they seek to enter, the nomad moves between a series of points, often in a periodic pattern, whereby they return every so often to various places after having moved over an entire trajectory. Native Americans live and remember between places that may together constitute a coherent region, but are not the focus of discrete memories of a single home. As Deleuze and Guattari put it, the life of the nomad is the intermezzo. For nomadic peoples, the intermezzo is a movement in what Deleuze and Guattari designate as smooth space. Unlike a striated space that is determined by physical walls and cartographic borderlines, including property lines, the smooth space of the nomad is spread out and has no definite borders. It is composed of entire borderlands, lands they know and remember collectively. As Deleuze and Guattari add, quote, the nomads are there on the land wherever there forms a smooth space that gnaws and tends to grow in all directions. The nomads inhabit these places, which are vectors of deterritorialization. The nomad is in a local absolute, an absolute that is manifested locally and engendered in a series of local operations of varying orientations: desert, steppe, ice, sea. Nomadism, thus understood, is just the converse of living in a single committed dwelling. Walter Benjamin describes dwelling in single places as, quote, fashioning a shell for ourselves. Such stable, sheltered dwelling is just what Native Americans do not seek as they migrated in regular temporal and placial patterns over millennia. If they are nowadays shelled in, this means being forced to live in reservations whose exact extent has been dictated by the U.S. government. Now I move to the price of displacement. A paradox emerges when we consider how much Native Americans and contemporary immigrants suffer from having been forced to move out of their homelands, whether to a reservation, as happened in the United States for nearly a century, until it was abandoned only recently as a practice in 1955, or as in the case of migrants moving to a virtually unknown country. But leaving immigrants aside and focusing on Native Americans, the paradox is this: how can there be such suffering on the part of these natives who are forced to move when they do not have anything like a single identifiable home to start with? We have seen that Native Americans are at home, Zuhausa, only in a diffuse territory that has no identifiable simple location, no single place, much less a house in that place. that can be considered the equivalent of what many Europeans and settler colonialists would identify as home. It is when such a singular home or heimat is lost that suffering often ensues for these settlers, whether as nostalgia, as in the case of my Swiss relatives, who purchased paintings of Switzerland, which they hung on the walls of their homes, and at which they looked longingly and nostalgically, or as being homesick, or as outright depression. These are all things that come from missing one's original home. Hence, the concerted efforts to build a single structure, a house, as it's called in English, is in a discrete location that can be called their home. Such housed homes are considered integral to settlement itself. Indeed, one could argue that the passion for settlement anywhere is often fueled by the desire to establish a new home in a new world. But if there's no such readily identifiable location or structure that could be considered a home, then just why do Native Americans suffer so greatly from being displaced? The answer can only be that they miss being in their homeland, the entire region where they have come to live as members of a given tribe over long periods of time. It is the loss of this homeland that occasions the distress. Now we see this vividly in the case of the Navajo, Diné Indians who were forced to move to another location outside their home territory in 1974, in keeping with the Navajo Hopi Land Settlement Act, whose enforcement meant that thousands of Navajos were displaced and relocated in territory that was previously unknown to them. The effects of this relocation were very grave. Alcoholism, depression, and acute disorientation. Comparable effects are found elsewhere in other situations of forced relocation. A report from 1979 states that the results of over 25 studies around the world indicate, with no exceptions, that the execution of compulsory relocation among rural populations with strong ties to their lands and homes is a traumatic experience for the majority of the relocatees. The Navajo themselves put it this way. There is, I quote from a chief in the Navajo tribe, "There is no land like this land. Our land is our life." The basis for this claim they express this way: to take from the earth without reciprocating, without first becoming a part of the life of the place, is to upset a sacred balance and ultimately to grow ill. At stake here is the human cost of native land loss, once more its dispossession. Yet not only does one's native land become inaccessible, but its sacred value is ignored and disrespected. This amounts, for Native Americans, to desecration of the homeland. What can such desecration mean? I turn to the fifth topic, earthwork. A crucial clue is supplied by Mohawk scholar Patricia Monteer Angus in the following statement. Although Aboriginal peoples maintain a close relationship with the land, it is not about control of the land. Earth is mother, and she nurtures us all. Sovereignty, when defined as my right to be responsible, requires a relationship with territory and not a relationship based on control of the territory. End of quote. Now, how to interpret this relationship where territory is equivalent to what I've been discussing as homeland? Here we must turn to something that is a key to understanding what I have just discussed as the paradox of displacement, namely that one can suffer from being displaced even if not from a home in the form of a house. This something is the role that Earth plays for Native Americans and doubtless for Native peoples elsewhere. When the relationship with Earth, understood as the basis of land, including borderlands, is disturbed, we can expect the dire consequences that are so conspicuous among the Navajo. And I should add, for many other Native Americans in the eastern United States who were forced to relocate westward in the wake of the severe strictures of President Andrew Jackson. His Indian Removal Act of 1830 forced many thousands of Native Americans west. This act led to the infamous Trail of Tears, along which thousands of Native Americans of diverse tribes were forced to move westward to reservations in the Middle West, including Oklahoma. But just how does Earth figure here? How is it related to land, especially homeland? Now, I take Earth to be what underlies land, construed as the effective surface of the Earth. Our lived body moves on and in relation to Earth by way of the land on which one stands or over which one walks. Such standing and walking are critical to living in the human as well as much of the animal life world. Consider here the preoccupation of very young children with learning how to stand and walk. This is not just to get across the room where one's favorite toy is located, but is a matter of establishing one's equilibrium in relation to the underlying earth, a matter of gaining balance when and where one stands and moves. The child is balancing her body on the earth through the land that is immediately under her feet. I say balancing her body on the earth through the land that is immediately under her feet. The land on which one stands and walks is specified in the particular places that become increasingly familiar, even more so, ever more so, as the child comes to know more of the surrounding life world. From childhood onward, we come to count on the land on which we struggle to become upright, to rely on it. However demanding and difficult it may be to traverse in given cases, these challenges are built into our sense of being at home in the world, at home in something more than a house. This something more, I suggest, is the earth that underlies this sense of being at home in a region through which oneself and other members of one's family or tribe move. The loss of a secure sense of this underlying earth means that one has lost touch with that on which one counts as an active presence in ongoing experience, as its guarantor, so to speak. Evidence of the importance of this factor shows up in children's fears and anxieties when thrust into new and unknown spaces. As we are currently witnessing so massively and tragically in the profound disorientation experienced by Palestinian children in Gaza who have suffered from the massive destruction resulting from Israeli bombardments. Operative here is what I've come to call the power of place. It's anchoring and orienting presence. When this is lost, as in the dispossession of traditional lands to which Native Americans, such as the Navajo, have been subjected since 1974, and others long before that, their anchorage in an accustomed life world is undermined. Severe anxiety is likely to follow. Not surprisingly, given what has been lost, namely the basis of one's orientation, there by way of familiar places, places that configure one's accustomed homeland, a homeland that is a borderland for the Navajo people. As a result, one feels lost in place, literally displaced. This cannot help but be profoundly disorienting for those who have been forced out of the familiar home places provided by their borderlands. Desecration here emerges as critical, for in such forced migration, the earth itself is the injured party. When native lands are lost, and then, as has happened all too often in the US and elsewhere, industrialized and polluted in an otherwise spoiled, as has in fact happened in the land lost by the Navajo, Native Americans feel that not only have they lost acreage, but that the earth itself, what underlies their former homeland, has been sullied, defaced, ruined. In such situations, as one Native American interpreter puts it, the earth itself is the injured party. The earth itself is the injured party. With the removal from one's accustomed homeland comes a devastating experience of placelessness. This goes deeper than disorientation. It stems from the loss of a primary connection to the earth, the part of the earth one has come to know and rely on in the form of familiar borderlands that have served as homelands for many generations of inhabitants. Land figures centrally in this major loss, land construed as the surface of the earth, the layer that mediates between our sensitively moving bodies and the earth below. We can put it this way: land is the face of the earth. Land itself comes in many forms, not only agricultural, as soil, but as the foundation of houses and other structures that are built or pitched upon it. All the familiar features of one's life world count as landed phenomena. Their loss, such as occurs in dispossession of the sort experienced by Native Americans as well as Palestinians in Gaza today, means the loss of one's accustomed surroundings that as landed phenomena counted as the basis of one's orientation in the life world. To lose touch with one's most familiar local landscape is to lose touch with the earth that underlies it. At stake here is losing one's place world. For the world of in der Weltsein, thematized by the early Heidegger, is a world of accustomed spaces on which one has come to count, often and most poignantly, since childhood. The loss of access to such spaces that comes from the usurpations of settler colonialism, as well as from the violence of outright war, is tantamount to the loss of the basis of one's homeland, as well as to the desecration of the earth that underlies this same homeland. In this brief talk, I have moved from noting the oblivion that has been the fate of most Native Americans, and doubtless of many Native peoples elsewhere, to the dispossession of Native homelands that occasion severe anxiety. The fact is that most contemporary Americans have no idea of which Native tribes lived in the areas where these same Americans now live. Ordinary American citizens are the contemporary version of settler colonialists, not because they are establishing new colonies, but because they are taking for granted their right to own land that was once home base for many generations of Native Americans. They, which includes myself as someone now living in the United States, have in effect dispossessed these natives of land that was once where these same natives lived. The lands themselves made up the homelands of American tribes who moved in and among them seasonally and in keeping with the natural rhythms of weather as it affected the growth of crops and plants and the presence of animals such as the buffalo. Rather than the stationary homes that most settlers from Europe and elsewhere built, Native Americans found home in many guises and places, none of which was entirely stationary. When these same people were driven out of their homelands into remote locations that often took the form of closed reservations, nothing short of prisons, collective prisons, they suffered acutely from such loss of land. Now, in this way, we have discerned that what was lost was not land that natives wish ever to own as such, but land regarded as the upper layer, the outer layer of the earth. This is land regarded as sacred space, having an intrinsic value that could never be translated into dollars. As Chief Seattle said famously in 1854, I quote him, this is a well-known statement, "The president in Washington sends word that he wishes to buy our land. But how can you buy or sell the sky, the land? The idea is strange to us. If we do not own the freshness of the air and the sparkle of the water, how can you buy them? Every part of the earth is sacred to my people. Every shining pine needle, every sandy shore, every mist in the dark woods, every meadow, every humming insect. We are all part of the earth and it is part of us." End of citation. So land had for Native Americans an intrinsic value that could not be calibrated in dollars or measured in square meters. This was land regarded as that in which what I call earthwork can emerge in the form of basic activities that recognize and affirm the intrinsic value of land seen as the surface, the very face of the earth. Its close covering, its vibrant, placially differentiated surface. Such activities do not merely occupy land in order to own and exploit it, but regard it as the source of affirmative activity, affirmative of the élan vital that Bergson identified as the spirited force that sustains life on earth and allows it to flourish. Now, it is land in this affirmative, life-affirmative sense that not only has been dispossessed or desecrated for Native Americans and for Native peoples elsewhere on the globe, but is in danger for all who currently inhabit the earth. Whether place-bound or placeless, all of the earth's peoples are imperiled by the ruination of land that sustains everyone, whether members of native tribes or settler colonialists who have removed these tribes from their aboriginal homelands. Such dispossession and desecration should concern us all, allowing us to wake up to the emergency that imperils life on earth today, an emergency that not only affects all living beings, but the entire landed earth itself. I end with a statement from a contemporary Native American that sums up all I've been saying succinctly. I've been saying it in too many words. He says it in these few but very telling words. The earth does not belong to me. I belong to the earth. The earth does not belong to me. I belong to the earth. Thank you.